RFK Jr. and LP cooperation. The underlying Austrian economics freedom revolution. Learning from the Ron Paul and Javier Milei revolutions. Just like men like Galileo, Copernicus, and Bruno were ahead of their time when they helped mankind overcome the myth that the Earth was the center of the universe, the economists referred to as the Austrian School of Economics, and men like 1974 Nobel laureate in economics F.A. Hayek, who is also Mick Jagger's and Elon Musk's favorite economist,
as a disciple of Friedrich von Hayek,
are likewise ahead of their time given their explanations for the workings and evolution of the modern global socio-economic order. Hayek! Popular science writer and acclaimed author, Matt Ridley says of Hayek,
somebody who came to Friedrich von Hayek comparatively late in life, I'm still catching up with him. Indeed, many of the insights that I thought I had discovered in my own readings and writings on the frontier of evolutionary biology and economics, it turns out Hayek had long before me. It's Hayek who first puts it all together.
Next we summarize just a bit of their wisdom and ongoing intellectual revolution, and relate it to RFK Jr.'s potential involvement with the Libertarian Party, with the ultimate goal of achieving a Javier Milei-like free market intellectual revolution and electoral triumph. Until the late 1700s most people lived in small, nearly self-sufficient farming towns. As technology improved, engines, factories, etc., the rate at which mankind could transform raw materials into wealth, clothing, watches, dwellings, etc., was rapidly increasing in cities. A rapidly growing class of businessmen, entrepreneurs, capitalists were constantly innovating and copying the innovations of competitors due to people's freedom to only trade their private property for what they deemed best, thus inadvertently cooperating to create and spread superior information and subsequent social order, turning cities and the entire planet into supercomputers that were constantly reordering mankind in increasingly productive and technologically advanced states. Morals are ways of acting, they too are knowledge which also emerges and spreads via economic competition to considerable degrees. It is hard-working, tolerant, courteous people who thanks to competition inevitably motivate everyone else to be likewise. Competition between increasingly wealthy productive factories capitalists motivated them to pay increasing amounts of wealth for labor relative to what people could earn in farms, causing people to move to cities quickly leading to massively complex metropolises supercomputers. The rapidly increasing profits wealth of entrepreneurs capitalists workers, via the banking finance sector, would be loaned invested in new factories businesses allowing workers to consume for the months or years it may take before the factories actually produced wealth. Profit-loss calculation by businessmen, and all private sector actors is what guides their actions in a manner where they order their actions and thus society in a way that more wealth is produced, revenue, than consumed, costs, thus being profitable pie increasing and also motivates them to overcome the potential risk of losses. As this process was happening many businessmen workers were significantly wealthier than others, especially poor people working in dangerous and unsanitary conditions. The social order was also getting mind-bogglingly complex, which among other factors, led an increasing number of people to believe in the myth that the complexity of the social order could be better or more fairly managed improved by having a coercive monopoly of experts in government-organized society from the top down. The environment was ripe for the emergence of a new religion mythology priesthood, socialism communism statism scientism. Eventually people like Karl Marx would describe these fallacies myths in a manner that was bound to go viral, and that is what happened with his bite-sized Communist Manifesto where he writes. The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property, abolition of the family. By destroying or greatly reducing private control of wealth and putting it in the hands of competition-immune coercive bureaucracies of experts, governments, socialism inadvertently destroyed the competitive knowledge discovery that only existed among competing entrepreneurs in the private sector, and also businessmen's profit-loss calculations which kept the private sector ordered in a profitable pie-increasing manner. This led to technological stagnation, more consumption than production leading to massive famines, and tyranny as the public had to be coerced into following the government plans. The socialists felt morally justified in killing people who didn't want to give up their wealth to sustain the central planning experts who they mistakenly believed would do a better job of running society than free entrepreneurs. Businessmen who would profit by paying laborers less than 100% of the revenue they helped produce were seen as greedy, malicious, immoral exploiters. Christians, Muslims, Jews, etc. who provided a moral basis for the freedom to not go along with socialism would be seen as immoral enablers of capitalist corporatist greed and exploitation and be subject to persecution. Since religious people saw the atheistic socialists who were persecuting them, not as economically ideologically misguided, but as being evil, satanic, etc., which the atheist Darwinian rational socialists found absurd, this made it even easier for them to kill and rid themselves of these irrational myth-believers who got in the way of all the great progress socialism would allegedly bring. For the advice of the Austrians, it is vitally important that we see our socio-economic chaos not as conspiracies by nefarious elites, nor bad politicians, or stupidity, but as an almost inevitable spread of viral self-reinforcing echo chambers of economic fallacies spread by well-meaning scholars and disastrous incentive structures that inadvertently cause Homo sapiens to self-destroy via central planning and runaway government growth enabled by central bank money creation. As F.A. Hayek tells us, it is necessary to realize that the sources of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men but high-minded idealists, and that in particular the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced. Hayek again. Most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our time have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler or Mussolini, Lenin or Stalin, appealed only to the worst instincts of their people, they also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. And the same applies to the complex history of our conflicts like Israel-Palestine. Ludwig von Mises writes, "Neither as judges allotting praise and blame nor as avengers seeking out the guilty should we face the past. We seek truth, not guilt, we want to know how things came about to understand them, not to issue condemnations." Miraculously for mankind, Ludwig von Mises nearly single-handedly stopped socialist intellectual expansion when he showed the impossibility of central planning via his essay Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, summarized simplified here, and also persuaded Austrian politicians away from communism in 1919. Mises writes, "I knew what was at stake. Bolshevism would lead Vienna to starvation and terror within a few days. Plundering hordes would take to the streets and a second bloodbath would destroy what was left of Viennese culture. The most important task I undertook was the forestalling of a Bolshevist takeover. The fact that events did not lead to such a regime in Vienna was my success and mine alone." For the Austrians, economic education was the key to prosperity and thus a civic duty, Mises writes. "All reasonable men are called upon to familiarize themselves with the teachings of economics. This is, in our age, the primary civic duty. Economics deals with society's fundamental problems, it concerns everyone and belongs to all. It is the main and proper study of every citizen." Later in 1944, Hayek would publish The Road to Serfdom, which would be read by millions and inspire future champions of freedom and capitalism like British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who read the book as an 18-year-old undergraduate at Oxford, and three-time US presidential candidate Ron Paul, who tells us, "My introduction to Austrian economics came when I was studying medicine at Duke University and came across a copy of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. After devouring this, I was determined to read whatever I could find on what I thought was this new school of economic thought, especially the works of Mises." Free market legend and 1976 Nobel laureate in economics Milton Friedman summarizes, "There is no figure who had more of an influence, no person who had more of an influence on the intellectuals behind the Iron Curtain than Friedrich Hayek. His books were translated and published by the underground, and black market editions read widely and undoubtedly influenced the climate of opinion that ultimately brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union." Argentinian President Javier Milei too stumbled upon the Austrians and realized that everything I had been teaching for the last 20 years about market structures was wrong. Armed with a profound understanding of economics, in just a few years he managed to spark a chain reaction of free market economic education emphasizing how central bank money creation was the main source of the government corporate incompetence and corruption which kept this once prosperous and proud nation desperately poor. Milei managed to educate millions of Argentinians, win the presidency, and become what is today in all likelihood the most important beacon of Austrian economics and thus the most important ideas needed to maximize freedom and resulting human flourishing. The astute young programmers and dreamers that overwhelmingly make up the world of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and also play such an increasingly prominent role in the culture of internet freedom, is already dominated by people who are fans of the Austrian school. The creators of Bitcoin were inspired by the Austrians. The second largest cryptocurrency, Ethereum, was created by Vitalik Buterin, who nicely sums up the ongoing intellectual revolution when he mentioned that,
"I thought that Austrian economics was like the world."
The Austrians also had a profound understanding of human nature and its co-evolution with the recently emerged modern market order. Homo sapiens has spent most of his evolutionary history living in small communal tribes where things like money, finance and banking, competitive knowledge discovery, and other so-called market mechanisms did not exist and are thus foreign to our instincts. The dodo bird quickly went extinct because it had not evolved to recognize humans as potential dangers. We similarly just line up for central planning and government-coordinated self-destruction via runaway government growth enabled by central bank money creation leading to inflationary chaos, the usual freedom-destroying and inefficient socialist central planning by experts and great leaders, and tribalistic good versus evil world wars. Thus freedom and emerging competitive knowledge discovery as opposed to leading to chaos and social injustice, is what 1. Enables and motivates the discovery and spread of superior information and subsequent social order, 2. Civilizes us, 3. Protects us from being coerced into doing something we don't want and thus allows us to live our lives as we wish, 4. And is vital for discovering the truth. Freedom is the ultimate algorithm. The above has summarized the rise and fall of Soviet-style socialist economic mythology, which is obviously not what we are dealing with today. Today we have disastrous central planning, loss of freedom, and unjustifiable confiscation of workers' wealth thanks to the complex evolution of runaway central banking, Federal Reserve, money creation. What is the point of no taxation without representation, or allegedly having a competitive and free private sector instead of coercive competition-immune bureaucratic control, when a bunch of clueless politicians and corrupt corporate interests can get the Federal Reserve to create virtually any amount of money to trade for all the worker-created wealth they want to fund their growing bureaucracies, corporate interests, and good versus evil wars? Leaving workers with less wealth, and more money per existing unit of wealth, and thus higher prices. During COVID mania lockdowns, just from March to May 2020, the Federal Reserve created over $3 trillion so that many people could stay home and consume without working, producing further shrinking the economic pie, leading to prices rising plus 20% in real estate and meat, plus 40% in gasoline, fueling a stock market boom, creating many new billionaires who can easily afford the higher prices, while your average American worker and retiree has seen the value of his savings and ability to buy a home greatly eroded, ultimately leading to a massive transfer of wealth to the already rich. This continued money creation and hidden taxation has been the main sort of robber of the increasing prosperity Americans, Argentinians, everyone, etc., could have been enjoying since the US, world, went off the gold standard in 1971. Fortunately, RFK Jr. has a profound understanding of this. He mentions in a podcast episode with the great economist David Stockman that
the Fed is also, it's what funds the war machine. Fiat currency was invented to fund wars, and a war machine would stop overnight if the Fed wasn't there to fund it. The Fed also, policies are designed to move wealth upward, increase these giant disparities of wealth that completely destabilize our democracy. And to do a lot of everything that comes out of the Fed is pretty bad. All of the ultimate impacts of it.
We finally discuss strong collaboration between RFK Jr. and the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party has the most ardent and well-informed, Austrianized, defenders of real freedom, capitalism and peace. In 2008 and 2012, via the so-called Ron Paul revolutions, thousands of libertarians learned about the damage of central banking via books like Ron Paul's aptly titled End the Fed. Similar to Milei, by simply teaching young people how the rising price of everything is the result, not of greedy capitalists or oil producers as the economically illiterate thinks, but of the alleged experts at the Federal Reserve via their money creation, Ron Paul sparked an intellectual chain reaction that had him going from college campus to campus with thousands of young people chanting End the Fed. Ron Paul showed how economic education, especially of relatively easy-to-learn and teach concepts like prices going up due to more money created by the Fed, could inspire people, leading to political changes. Milei proved it. Ron Paul and Milei were just catching up to the Austrians who were and still remain way ahead of our times. In his article The Task Confronting Libertarians, written in 1969, author of the most popular Introduction to Free Markets Economics in One Lesson, Henry Hazlitt, advises. This brings me, finally, to one more single issue on which all those libertarians who lack the time or background for specialized study can effectively concentrate. This is in demanding that the government provide an honest currency, and that it stop inflating. This issue has the inherent advantage that it can be made clear and simple because fundamentally it is clear and simple. All inflation is government-made. All inflation is the result of increasing the quantity of money and credit, and the cure is simply to halt the increase. If libertarians lose on the inflation issue, they are threatened with the loss of every other issue. If libertarians could win the inflation issue, they could come close to winning everything else. If they could succeed in halting the increase in the quantity of money, it would be because they could halt the chronic deficits that force this increase. If they could halt these chronic deficits, if they could halt the constant increase in spending, they could halt the constant increase in government power. Also Hayek. All those who wish to stop the drift toward increasing government control should concentrate their effort on monetary policy. Mises. Inflation is the fiscal complement of statism and arbitrary government. It is a cog in the complex of policies and institutions which gradually lead toward totalitarianism. Inflationism, however, is not an isolated phenomenon. It is only one piece in the total framework of politico-economic and socio-philosophical ideas of our time. Just as the sound money policy of gold standard advocates went hand in hand with liberalism, free trade, capitalism and peace, so is inflationism part and parcel of imperialism, militarism, protectionism, statism and socialism. Of course. This is one of the simple vital ideas that inadvertently underpin the Ron Paul and Milei revolutions. By RFK Jr. forming a close relationship with the LP, he immediately taps into hundreds of thousands of very well-informed fervent anti-Fed, anti-war, hardcore freedom of speech, medical freedom, mini-economists that can serve as an intellectual booster rocket for all the pro-freedom ideas needed. RFK Jr. already dealt a devastating blow to the priesthood of scientism and the Fauci Pope via his The Real Anthony Fauci, and libertarians are ideal friends to likewise deal a devastating blow to the just as misguided and mythical Keynesian economics central banking priesthood and supporting myths. No political pundits, regardless of their impressive network TV appearances, could have predicted that a mild-mannered country doctor, Ron Paul, would have thousands of young people reading books about economics fervently chanting "End the Fed" at massive college rallies in 2008-12. Similarly, no pundits could have predicted how Javier Milei, a former footballer and rock star in Argentina, could have likewise inspire millions via economic education and become Argentina's president. RFK Jr. can actually improve upon Milei by seeing too much government, not as some ungodly immoral injustice as Milei mistakenly does, but as the result of intellectual error, and thus have a more sympathetic, educational, and less combative and divisive approach. Hayek. When I stressed that is genuine intellectual error that we have to fight, what I meant to bring out is that we ought to remain aware that our opponents are often high-minded idealists whose harmful teachings are inspired by very noble ideals. It seems to me that the worst mistake a fighter for our ideals can make is to ascribe to our opponents dishonest or immoral aims. We hope that this essay helps the courageous folks at the RFK Jr. campaign smell blood, and really identify and hopefully amplify the key ideas and thinkers of freedom, who can once again lead to intellectual and electoral triumph. As free marketeer and founder of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, Lou Rockwell mentions far better men have already provided the answers to our problems, so I'll just conclude by once again quote them. Mises. Liberalism is rationalistic. It maintains that it is possible to convince the immense majority that peaceful cooperation within the framework of society better serves their rightly understood interests than mutual battling and social disintegration. It has full confidence in man's reason. It may be that this optimism is unfounded and that the liberals have erred. But then there is no hope left for mankind's future. And finally, in 1964, as socialist economic myths fallacies were still expanding and freedom retreating, Henry Hazlitt gave a speech in the presence of Mises and other leading freedom fighters educators which wonderfully captures the civilization-saving atlas-like ethos of the Austrians. We quote from the last few sections of his speech. "We haven't been good enough. I am going to give what is no doubt a terribly oversimplified answer to that question. In the first place, we are almost hopelessly outnumbered. Our voices are simply drowned out in the general tumult and clamor. But there is another reason. And this is hard to say, above all to an audience of this sort, which contains some of the most brilliant writers and minds in the fields of economics, of jurisprudence, of politics, not only of this age but of any age. But the hard thing must be said that, collectively, we just haven't been good enough. We haven't convinced the majority. Is this because the majority just won't listen to reason? I am enough of an optimist, and I have enough faith in human nature, to believe that people will listen to reason if they are convinced that it is reason. Somewhere, there must be some missing argument, something that we haven't seen clearly enough, or said clearly enough, or, perhaps, just not said often enough. A minority is in a very awkward position. The individuals in it can't afford to be just as good as the individuals in the majority. If they hope to convert the majority, they have to be much better, and the smaller the minority, the better they have to be. They have to think better. They have to know more. They have to write better. They have to have better controversial manners. Above all, they have to have far more courage. And they have to be infinitely patient. We have a duty to speak even more clearly and courageously, to work harder, and to keep fighting this battle while the strength is still in us. But I can't do better than to read the words of the great economist, the great thinker, the great writer, who honors me more than I can say by his presence here tonight, Ludwig von Mises. This is what he wrote in the final paragraph of his great book on socialism 40 years ago. Everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders, no one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others. And no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone, in his own interests, must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern, the interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. Those words uncannily prophetic words were written in the early 1920s. Well, I haven't any new message, any better message than that. Even those of us who have reached and passed our 70th birthdays cannot afford to rest on our oars and spend the rest of our lives dozing in the Florida sun. The times call for courage. The times call for hard work. But if the demands are high, it is because the stakes are even higher. They are nothing less than the future of human liberty, which means the future of civilization.